Welcome to Breaking Bread. My name is Untitled. Today I'm going to be looking at the book of 1 Timothy and I'll start with chapter 1 today. Paul's letter to Timothy is a very personal letter. In fact, in verse 2 of 1 Timothy 1, he addresses Timothy as his true son in the faith, demonstrating the bond between them. So we can see that this letter is not just from an apostle to a disciple or from an older minister to a younger minister. It's also from a father to a son in the faith. One of the early things that Paul charges Timothy with is preventing people from teaching false doctrines in the church. As much as it is important to teach right doctrines as a minister or as a believer, it is also important to counteract or, if possible, prevent people who are teaching false doctrines. Paul says the goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart, from a clear conscience or a good conscience, and sincere faith. But people who have abandoned these elements, who are not walking in love, who do not have a pure heart, who do not have a sincere faith or a good conscience, they are trying to teach things. They want to demonstrate their knowledge of the law, and they are by so doing affirming things that they do not even understand. The law is good, and Paul emphasizes this, but then he says that the law was originally written for people who are sinners. So there is a proper application of the law. That's what he says in verse 8. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. But in order to do that, you have to have a pure heart, a clear conscience, and a sincere faith. The intent to walk in love towards others generates accuracy in interpretation of scriptures. The next thing that Paul highlights in his letter to Timothy is thanksgiving. He gives thanks to God as he looks back at who he used to be, a violent man, a persecutor, who injured others and all of that. And it's interesting that Paul never quite loses sight of who he used to be, not from a perspective of guilt, but rather from a perspective of thanksgiving. He acknowledges the grace of God and the transformation that it has brought upon his life by looking back at what he used to be and what God has made him to be and what God is making him to be. So through him, the knowledge of God is spreading through the nations and across to so many people. It is a way of giving glory and thanks to God when we acknowledge what we were without him and what we are through him. The way that Paul wraps up chapter 1 of this letter is to again charge Timothy to take hold of the prophecies that has gone ahead of him and says, my son, look, you have to run with those prophecies, which means that, and he says you have to do this, with faith and a good conscience, which some people have abandoned. I will come back to that in a second. But Paul says that you can't just hear those prophecies and expect them to come to fulfillment. You've got to run with them. How do you run with prophecies? You speak them in your prayers. As you look at the things that have been spoken concerning you, you bring it to prayers and you actively pray that God will bring those things to pass while confessing that those things will come into existence. You do all of this with faith in your heart and a good conscience. Paul says that Hymenaeus and Alexander, they've abandoned these two things, faith and a good conscience, and they made a shipwreck of their faith. And so it is important for us as believers to constantly examine ourselves, to make sure that our conscience is clear before God, and to continuously walk in faith in order to bring about the fulfillment of the promises or the prophecies that God has spoken about us. Thank you very much for joining us. In the next session or next episode, I'm going to look at the second chapter of 1 Timothy, and we'll talk a bit more about Paul's instructions on worship and all of that.